Welcome today to our lecture about agriculture. Through the middle of the 1800s, people thought that what we call the Great Plains today was essentially a desert, as you can read on this map. And they knew there was grass there, but they thought it wasn't any good for agriculture because they were used to the kind of the European and then East Coast experience where you chop down trees. Trees represented good agricultural land. You chopped down the trees and then you farmed it. And when they came to grasslands, they thought that was a desert. And indeed, folks, wagon trains passed over this for a generation or so, as we saw going through Kansas and Nebraska, areas that are we know as the wheat belt today, some of the richest farmland in the world is Nebraska, Kansas, and so on. Until the invention of the steel plow and the coming of the railroads. And then they could not only grow crops, but also ship them out. So we saw that, and a reminder about how in the United States at least, and as we talk more about agriculture, we'll be looking at worldwide agriculture too, but focusing on the U.S. for now. The tall grass prairie, sticking all the way out into Iowa and Illinois and into Indiana somewhat, where the natural grasses were taller than people. And then in the far west, getting it up close to the Rocky Mountains, we had the short grass prairie, and in between we had mixed. Some areas were taller, some areas were shorter. And of course, in all of this area along the rivers, you had some settlement because you had trees along the rivers, particularly cottonwood trees. But so the settlers settled the rivers first to start agriculture there. And as you know, the reason that wheat and corn, grass is on the left, wheat is in the middle, corn is on the right. They are basically types of grasses, so naturally they grew best in natural grassland areas once you plowed under the grass. And the roots were so deep and thick, which was one of the reasons why they couldn't break it up with the traditional wooden plows. They had to use wait for the invention of the new steel plow. 1837, a guy named John Deere, that's where they started making other machinery, became the John Deere Corporation. But people built what are called sod houses. In other words, they chopped up the roots. The roots of these tall grasses held the soil together, and you basically chopped them up and made kind of like bricks out of it. And you stacked it up and made your house. That was a lot of what the pioneers lived in on the left side of the picture. And on the right side, you see a modern house. I don't know, maybe it's 50 years old or something, but that shows you what a sod house looks like. And you put some wood or stuff across the top, and then you could also you could put soil right on top of your roof to catch the rain and act as your roof. And today, these areas are the tall grass prairie. Pretty much corresponds, as you see, with the map on the left, which is the areas of greatest corn production in the United States, and that extends. It's focused around Iowa, but extends over into Illinois, southern Minnesota, somewhat into Nebraska. And then on the right-hand side, you see the wheat, the map of wheat. And I mentioned there's different kinds of wheat in that some of them is winter wheat that they plant late in the summer and let it grow through the winter, and then it has a head start, whereas the usual wheat is more like you just plant it in spring, harvest it in fall. And of course, the wheat can survive the winters just like the grass in your lawn survives. You don't have to plant grass. Remember, we're talking about types of grasses, right? You don't have to plant grass in your lawn every year. It survives the winter. It just goes dormant. And as we talk in the United States, another interesting thing to think about is the grassland areas, the ones that both the tall and short grass prairies, are still the primary agricultural areas in the United States today. And there's different ways to define that. But one is simply, you can drive around anywhere in the United States and see farms. You can be in New Hampshire, you can be in Florida, you can be in Washington State. And so how do there's farms everywhere. How do you tell where there's more concentration of agriculture? And one way is by asking what percent of the land is in farms, and this is by county. And you see very distinctly when you ask that question, here was that tall grass prairie, again, Iowa, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and even western Ohio, about Columbus is kind of the midpoint. You go east of Columbus, you get hillier lands, more Appalachian. West of Columbus, you really start to get into the the agricultural belt of the Midwest. And then also the short grass prairie through the Great Plains, starting in the two Dakotas, then Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, particularly the Oklahoma Panhandle, which is that section that juts out above Texas, the Texas Panhandle. And we talked about this also, that when you have big states like Texas, the western half and the northwestern Texas is much more agricultural than the eastern half of Texas near Louisiana, where they have crops, but it's different kinds of crops. They have cotton and even some sugarcane. But the far west, in fact, the cities, the twin cities here, so to speak, of Dallas, Fort Worth, it's been said that Dallas, which is on the eastern half of those two cities, they're only about 50 or 60 miles away, and they've in effect grown into one metropolitan area, Dallas, Fort Worth. If you think of it this way, Dallas on the east was kind of a southern town. It had one of in the days of when the South primarily grew cotton, Dallas had the biggest cotton, was the biggest cotton center in the United States. Whereas Fort Worth was always a cowboy town. That was the western, bucking broncos, right? That short distance of 100 miles gave Fort Worth more of a cattle focus. That was a center for when the railroads came out and they drove cattle. To go back, when the railroads came out initially,
or still, you drive, you watch movies and you see them driving cattle. Where are they driving them to? They're driving them to railroads to be shipped east for the most part. And so Fort Worth was a big focus of the cattle industry. So Fort Worth, Texas was like a western cowboy town. Dallas was more of a cotton town. Now, of course, they're both big metro areas, and both of them are like oil towns. So, and let's not forget our neighbor, Canada. And when we talked about in population, we talked about the fact that Canada was actually an elongated country because so much of its population was concentrated within 200 miles or so of the border of the United States. And while this map, these are the agricultural areas of Canada. We're talking much more than 200 miles here. The wheat belts through the Canadian prairie provinces, what we call the Great Plains, the Canadians call the prairies. Through I always remember BASM, British Columbia for B, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. That's where their wheat belt is. And in the east, they have more other kinds of crops. They have apples and potatoes and dairy cows and so forth. But the point of this map is to show that obviously in Canada, because you're getting more and more north, you get up into the tundra and polar bears and stuff, there's very little agriculture up there. So most of Canada is untouched by agriculture. It's very thin soil because of all the glaciation that took place. But my point is that Canada is an elongated country also in terms of its agriculture, which is all concentrated along the U.S. border. simply because it's farther to the south, and of course it's warmer, and you can't grow very much once you get beyond, say, 500 miles of the U.S. border. Worldwide, we saw the grasslands in the United States and parts of Canada, so this map calls them prairies. The Pampas in Argentina, and this is a similar climate zone. If you flip, here's the equator, right? Notice that we're about in the Pampas of Argentina. That's South America's greatest grasslands, and it's about the same distance from the equator as are the American and Canadian grasslands. They call them the steppes through Europe and Russia, the veld in South Africa, and there's two little sections one shows on this map. No special name, but in southern Australia, and you also have another section in southwestern Australia with very good grasslands. And we'll see that these are some of the richest agricultural areas of the world, just like the American grasslands are the richest, most productive agricultural areas in the United States and Canada. And we're going to see that quite a bit of world agriculture relies on these very small percentage of the Earth's surface. We'll see that. And if something dramatic happened to all these areas, much of the world would starve, maybe even us in the United States, because so much agriculture depends on these regions, particularly for the basic foods. We can survive without coffee and bananas, but we can't survive without corn and wheat. And in general, that leads into the comment that the world agriculture reflects the world's physical geographical regions. If you get mountains, ice caps, deserts, you're not going to have much, if any, agriculture going on there. And we won't go through all these. These are also known as biomes, aka also known as biomes. And we see, again, these grasslands, which on this map are in kind of this yellow, not bright yellow, but pale yellow color. There's the Pampa, that area of South Africa, the two areas show here in Australia, and then the steppe region, so forth. And other smaller areas like central Spain is kind of like that too. Then, of course, we have the rainforest, where there's actually not a lot of agriculture. We have deserts like the Sahara, and the deserts of Central Asia like the Gobi Desert. Southwestern United States is desert, so on. You're not going to have much agricultural there. There are other regions won't go through them all, but obviously in Greenland we have ice caps. Antarctica doesn't even show on this map because, of course, there's really no agriculture in Antarctica. The Arctic and alpine tundra regions, which are not only in the far north in Canada and northern Russia and the Siberia area, but also in, for example, the central plateau of Tibet, where the Himalayas are, the high Andes, where you have ice caps and so forth. In the lime green color are the temperate boreal forest. If you've ever seen a movie like Dr. Zhivago, the boreal forest is very thin, because it's so cold, thin, sparse trees. If you've seen a movie like Dr. Zhivago, where they drive in a sleigh, think of an area where the trees are so sparse you can drive a sleigh through them, pulled by horses or something in the wintertime, or a snowmobile. You can't do that much through a forest in the United States, but you can in Canada and Siberia. And that's called the boreal forest, and it's not good for agriculture. So here's another map. I'm going to show you several of these, saying to make the point. This map is called agricultural suitability, and basically the areas in dark green
shows the areas that are good for some type of agriculture, or at least crops, because like in the United States, we have cattle grazing in much of this area. But in terms of if you're going to plant something, so again, the grasslands of the United States, Mexico, through the Andes, we talked about the Aztecs and the Incas, through the Andes of South America, and of course the main focus in the Pampa of Argentina, overlapping into Uruguay, which is that country there. Eastern Brazil has some good agricultural land, particularly it's tropical, so you get coffee and sugarcane. You do have a belt of good agricultural land along basically between the Sahara Desert and then the rainforest in Africa. And that's through countries like Nigeria, and all the way over to Ethiopia, where you do have substantial populations. Little bits and pieces of good land in South Africa, and Australia is very much focused on the coasts of Australia, particularly the eastern and southern coast, and this little corner near Perth. Of course, a good belt through Europe and into Siberia. If we go back to Jared Diamond's book about why Eurasia, and the thing about how you had this east-west band of good agricultural land, so you had movement back and forth across that zone. And then India, the Asian subcontinent, has some good agricultural land, and of course China and Japan. And in a sense, and this is one of those things where we don't want to mix cause and effect. I mean, we could say, well, isn't it a good thing that India, with almost 1 billion people, has a lot of good cropland, and China, with 1 billion people, also has a lot of good cropland. Because wow, how else will they feed those people? But of course, it's the reverse. I mean, the population has grown to that amount because the good cropland is available. That's enabled the population to go back to our buddy Malthus. Right? Otherwise, the population would have, in the old days, would have starved or died off, and it would not have grown to that amount of density without good cropland being available. But if you look, it'd be an interesting thing to estimate what percentage, just kind of guesstimate if you want. What is that? Maybe 15-20% of the Earth's surface is suitable for crops. There's not a lot of, once you take away the deserts, the ice caps, the high mountains, the boreal forest with the scattered trees, and so on, you don't have an awful lot of good agricultural land left. Same thing here. And we see the pink areas that show predominantly livestock grazing. So, for example, in Australia, that's usually sheep. Same thing in parts of South Africa, sheep and cattle. A lot of Brazil, you've seen that, where more and more they're cutting down the Amazon rainforest to do cattle grazing, grazing in the United States on the Great Plains. Predominantly here, those very productive grasslands are kind of this tan color, I guess it is. So you see those again, the Pampa and the here, and the grasslands of the United States there, and so forth. Mixed farming is in green. Mixed farming means, and there's much of that in the United States and in Europe, means a mixture of livestock and crops, like you would see, say, driving through Ohio. Indeed, you look at the map, and that's pretty much what Ohio is. And the very lightest color is predominantly non-arable lands and forests. So again, you see most of the world's surface is not good for agriculture because of it's too cold, it's too dry, deserts, ice caps, glaciers, and so forth. Much of the world, well, I shouldn't say much of the world, some areas of the world, still in Africa, still in South America, have what's called slash and burn agriculture, also known as Swidden. You see it spelled there. And that is where you clear land. This is a remnant of kind of the hunting and gathering days, and it doesn't mean that these folks are necessarily hunters and gatherers, but because even in parts of Brazil, you still have this where you clear land, burn it, and you see you don't have to clear it completely. You basically just chop the trees down, burn it. The burned vegetation provides fertilizer. Ash from trees is good fertilizer. So that provides fertilizer for 2 or 3 years. So you can plant crops. It might be sugarcane, it might be corn and beans or whatever. And then in 2 or 3 years, that ash, fertilizer from that ash wears out. It's all depleted. So now you have to move on. And it's not, initially people thought like, well, people just kind of wander around randomly. They don't. Folks have a distinct pattern. They go, they move over a half mile or so. Now they clear a big patch of land there, burn it. That provides fertilized land for a few years. Then you move on to another area. Meanwhile, the areas you've abandoned, the forest regrows. And in 20 or 30 years, or maybe a little less, maybe 15 years or so, you can come back to it and start the process over again. So it's kind of the slash and burn is kind of a natural way of using fertilizer and so forth. Once more, cropland is a small part of the Earth's surface. You can see again the same patterns we discussed. And if you want to make a map where you express this by country, you see that there are very few countries in the world, fortunately India is one of them, where 40% or more of the land is actually good for agricultural land. The other blues or so are 30 or so percent. And even in the United States, it's only 15 or 20% of the land is suitable for agriculture. When you take away, think of all the things you're subtracting. You're subtracting, swamps in Florida, the desert. Of course, we're including Alaska in these calculations, and very little of Alaska is really suitable for much agriculture. Really, just in the Panhandle, there's quite a bit. Forestry in the forested lands in the Northeast, where actually forests are reclaiming land that had been cleared for agriculture and so on. So, and you see the countries that have the very smallest amount of land suitable for agriculture. That's this beige or tan color here, and this light yellow. Unfortunately, it's much of Africa and much of northern Latin America, where you've got, in Africa's case, extensive deserts, both the Sahara and the Namib deserts down here in southwestern Africa, and rainforest and so on. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of land in Africa that's very good for agriculture. Fortunately, Nigeria, which is the country with the greatest population in Africa, also has the highest proportion of agriculture. But again, that's a cause and effect thing. It's fortunate. You say, well, Nigeria's got the biggest population in Africa. It's good that they've got highest percentage, highest proportion of cropland. But it's also a confusing cause and effect. It's because that area has all this cropland that the population has been able to grow, although it's really, kind of reached a peak at this point in terms of what Nigeria's population is. Of course, Europe looks pretty good on this map because there are good farmlands in France and Germany, and these are amounts of you don't have to know these numbers, but kind of amounts of I guess these are millions. The numbers are millions of hectares, which is about 2.5 acres. But anyway, you can compare that the 139 million hectares in the United States is a little bit more than the whole Eurasian steppe region. And you can see India, and particularly the Ganges River, Ganges basin, is the most agricultural area there.
in China, in various river basins, particularly the Yellow River Basin and so on. And I thought this map was interesting. It takes a while to see where the outline of the United States is, but if you look at it, you can, there's my cursor, obviously it's California, Florida down here and so on. And it just shows they colored in the predominant crops in different shades. So you have the corn and soybeans. We keep talking about corn in the Midwest, but it's also true that, in fact, this is very true in Ohio. You ask a farmer what he or she plants in Ohio, and they will say corn and beans, meaning, of course, corn, cow corn, rather than sweet corn, because sweet corn is a small percent of the corn production. And beans meaning soybeans, because soybeans are very productive. They grow on the ground like peanuts. They can be ground up into meal. It's what's used in stuff like Hamburger Helper, or if you buy a fast food where it's not an all beef burger, that's soy meal in there. Tofu is made out of soybeans. Huge amount is pressed into oil, various kinds of vegetable oil that you use for cooking and so on. So corn and soybeans through this region, more what else? The wheats you see in the greens. Cotton is actually in blue here in western or the Texas Panhandle on irrigated agriculture. Fruit, nuts, and vegetables in places like Florida, of course, citrus fruits in primary industry, and also in California, both particularly every kind of nut crop other than citrus fruit. I mean, they do have some citrus there, but almonds and pecans and walnuts and all this is particularly grown in California. The green is wheat, so you see that the northern wheat belt in the Dakotas, and then the more southerly wheat belt through the Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma Panhandle, and so on. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting map. And it's interesting to see where there's not much to speak of in terms of crops. And notice it doesn't show livestock here, because you would have a lot of livestock on some of these the western Great Plains through like Colorado, Wyoming, and so on. But not really a lot of specialized agriculture through the Appalachians and so forth. This in the Northeast, that's mostly forested, although you do see the old Erie Canal zone here. And the some of the Amish, this is in Pennsylvania, the Amish country, where they do a much more traditional farming. Food diversity. Humans grow 10,000 species of plants for food. It'd be interesting to sit down one day when you have nothing to do and make a list of how many different kinds of foods have you ever eaten. Cranberries, walnuts, butter beans, lima beans, so on, and see if you can come up with 100. Because the reality is, while we grow these 10,000 things around the world, only 90 of these crops give us 90% of our food, and 4 crops give the world 2/3 of its food energy. It's actually 65%. And those are, where do we, talking about, how would we, something happen to these crops where people would actually starve? We can all survive without bananas and coffee and, walnuts. But if you think of it in terms of the amount of food energy that the world population gets out of crops, what are the biggies? There's 4 biggies, and they are rice and wheat. About 25% of our food crops right there, from the energy we get from corn, 7%, sugar, 9%. And there are a few others, millet and sorghum, which are wheat type crops that they grow in Africa, that survive in that semi-desert area, particularly along the Sahel, Sahel, which is that
strip, that wet season, dry season strip of land between the rainforest and the Sahara Desert. Potatoes 4%, soybeans 3%, and so forth. So where is rice? We actually grow quite a bit of rice in the United States in a very small area. It's focused in a very small area. This is that Mississippi Delta region. I told you about that before. It's called the Delta, though it's a misnomer. It's not the actual Delta of the Mississippi, but it's that low-lying area in northern Louisiana and adjoining Mississippi and Arkansas along the Mississippi River. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of that is simply grown for export. But that's, and actually, even though the U.S. Doesn't grow a huge proportion of the world's rice, because so much of it is exported, we're actually the United States is a big player in the international rice export market. But most rice in the world is grown in southern and eastern Asia. Let's call it Southeast Asia, but basically China, India, the countries through here, like Burma, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and then Indonesia and the Philippines. This is the big rice producing area of the world, and where rice is their mainstay of food, just like wheat in our culture is, as opposed to, say, corn in like Mexico and much of Latin America, where they have the corn-based flours, so tacos and things like that, instead of the white wheat bread. So rice in Southeast Asia, and rice paddies are very intensive agriculture. Look at the person on the right. Literally, they start little rice seeds, and then they transplant them. And literally, it's a back-breaking process where you put this stuff in by hand. And the other thing this map shows is how humans have modified, or this photo shows how humans have modified the landscape with terracing. You can't grow crops well on very steep land. Well, you can't really grow crops at all. You can grow them for one season, then the soil washes away. Because but you can make like steps, which are called terraces. And in Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of mountains, a lot of the land is terraced. This has taken people centuries of backbreaking work to build up these terraces over time, so that you can have flat land. Basically, you make flat land out of the mountains by turning the mountain into steps. And it's not always rice. You can have other kinds of things on terrace. And the Andean Indians terraced land for corn. The Aztecs and the Incas both. And in the United States, nobody's doing this kind of work. In the United States, rice seeds are planted by airplane, and they're harvested, of course, by machinery. And we dump a lot of fertilizer on. It's not as an efficient way, because 5 rice seeds fall out of the airplane together and they choke each other off and die. But we've got a lot of land, we get a lot of space. Whereas in Southeast Asia, you want every plant to grow properly. So they put a lot more hand labor into it. Production of wheat, it's almost the same thing about who has those natural grasslands. Well, the darkest brown areas have the most wheat. So United States, Canada, France, Russia, the Ukraine region here, India, so on. Those are the big wheat producers. Countries that have deserts and tropics don't produce a lot of wheat, so Africa produces very little wheat, as we see. Here's another map showing it not by country boundaries, but simply by dots, so to speak. And again, you see the 2 belts of winter and spring wheat extending into Canada. A lot of wheat grown through
Europe and through the steppe on into Russia. A lot of wheat grown in India, particularly the Ganges River Basin in northern India, and a lot of wheat grown in eastern China. More so than the rice. The rice is more in southern China, near Southeast Asia. Some wheat grown on both those good sections in Australia and in the Pampa of Argentina. So what are we seeing again? We're seeing the natural grasslands, right, where wheat is grown. And the same thing is true with corn. We've seen the United States corn map several times. The section that was the tall grass prairie, well, here it is again. There's the Pampa in Argentina again. Some areas of southern Brazil, Europe, and then eastern northern China, about the same latitudes as the United States where we grew it, and so on. Not as much corn, certainly not as much corn as wheat in India. Some in Indonesia, and a little bit in South Africa. So we're running through these crops. Remember the big four, right? Was wheat, corn, soybeans, and sugarcane. So here's one map. Now it's sugarcane. We're flipping now, in that now we're talking about a tropical crop. You can't grow sugarcane in Iowa. Remember, the Caribbean was a big sugarcane area. In fact, one of the reasons that Europeans colonized, brought slaves from Africa, so on. In these Caribbean islands, many of them, Cuba being the best example, are still big sugarcane producing areas. Some in Mexico, coastal South America, some in coastal Africa, some in Egypt along the Nile, a lot around India and Southeast Asia, the Philippines, even southern Japan produces some sugarcane. And northern Australia, which is, of course, northern Australia is closest to the equator. Remember, we're flipped. The latitudes are flipped, so to speak. So northern Australia is hotter than southern Australia. And so those are all places where sugarcane is grown. If we look at actual total output, even the United States has some in both. Hawaii doesn't show up on this map, but we do some in Hawaii and Louisiana. It's about the two places we grow sugarcane. As I said, coastal Mexico, coastal South America, particularly southern Brazil. A lot of Brazilian sugarcane now is used as ethanol in Brazil. Almost everybody's car uses alcohol as a fuel rather than gasoline. They have a gallon of gasoline to start their cars, because it turns out alcohol is not it doesn't give you enough kick to start your car. So they have a 1 gallon of gasoline. You fill it up, every 2 months or something, used to start the car. But basically, all their cars run on ethanol, and not just ethanol additive to gasoline, but they just simply run on alcohol. And a lot of Brazil's ethanol is used for fuel. We do some of that, of course, in the United States with ethanol from corn added to gasoline. Cuba is still, and the Caribbean islands, still major sugarcane producers. A lot of sugarcane in the Ganges River Basin of India and along the coast, the west coast of India, and then southern China and some areas of Southeast Asia. But a lot of these, tropical, again, sugarcane is a tropical crop. Right? However, sugar beets, you can also get sugar out of what are called sugar beets. It's a sweet beet, and those are grown. This is now a northern crop, so you notice we don't have very much of it in the United States. But what we do grow is over in places like the Snake River Basin in Idaho, North Dakota, extending on over into Canada. So this is that, root crops generally tend to be cooler crops, like potatoes in Maine and Idaho and so on.
a lot of sugar beets in Europe and on into the Soviet Union, but this is an alternative way of getting sugar. Who are the major exporters of crops? And what is their share? Well, one of the reasons I show this is to look at who's the world's biggest exporter of maize, which of course is corn. The United States, 53%. Who's the biggest exporter of wheat? The United States, 23%. Who's the biggest exporter of rice? The United States, 90%. Even though, again, even though we don't grow as much rice as Southeast Asia does, we export almost all of it because Americans don't eat a lot of rice. You know, somebody may have rice once every 2 weeks or something. Whereas in Southeast Asia, folks having rice every day, just as the way we use wheat products every day and so on. And the difference between the paddy, at least I should say, the United States exports large percent of paddy rice. That means it's basically unprocessed. It's like brown rice, unprocessed, simply sent to export. Milled rice means it's been refined into white rice, essentially. And it's interesting, and a lot of times Americans buy this rice back, I suppose, when we buy them, because you can buy imported rice. But there's an old saying about an apple that the skin is the best part. And a lot of times on these wheat crops, if like whole wheat bread is healthier for you than the white refined wheat bread, where you take all the good stuff out of the whole kernel and you just leave the bleach, what's called the bleach flour. So whole wheat bread, and you have to buy whole wheat, because if you look and just buy wheat bread, and if you read what's in it, it's primarily white flour that they've added some coloration to and a little bit of whole wheat flour to it. So you really have to buy the whole wheat bread to get the good value of the wheat product. And the same thing is true with rice. It's the same deal. Brown rice has all the nutrients and so on in the skin of the rice that is lost when you mill it or refine it into the white rice. And the same thing is true with sugar. If you buy a brown sugar, it has more of those nutrients than if you buy the white refined white sugar. In any case, the United States is a major exporter. If anything happened to that grassland, that grain area of the United States, people would starve in the world. I mean, we'd stop exporting it, I suppose, so Americans would be okay. But so much of American agriculture enters into the world trade market that, a good portion of the world relies on the United States for this export of corn, wheat, and rice all over the world. Other countries, similarly, like Argentina. You see, Argentina is a big player. Remember, they have the pampa grasslands. Big player in the export of maize or corn, and again, a big player in the export of wheat and so forth. So a few countries, the point of this is that a few countries are producing a lot of the world's surplus foods. And it's those 8 or 10 countries that have parts of those national. Another way of showing that, who are the net exporters and importers of food? Net meaning subtract out what you import. So you got to figure out a way to, like, through food energy or something, to say, well, the United States is a big exporter of corn and wheat, but we're a huge importer of bananas and coffee and so forth. So somehow you subtract that out. So that's what the net means. What are you exporting minus what you have to import? And again, not a surprise to see that U.S. and Canada are big exporters. Much South America, particularly Brazil and of course Argentina and Uruguay, where the pampas grasslands are. Most of the European countries, or some of the European countries, particularly in that zone that goes on into Russia. This area is like where the Ukraine is. And Australia is a big food exporter. It also reflects the fact that you don't have a lot of people, right? If you get take Australia and Canada,
And the United States is like 310 million people. Australia and Canada, Canada's got like 30, I think. Australia's got like 25 million. So you have all this land area. So if you're using all this land to grow food, but you've only got 20 million people, well, yeah, you're going to be a food export. And it's the reverse, of course. The opposite from the dark greens are the folks, the countries that are food deficient, particularly the orange ones. Secondly, the beige or tan ones. And you notice, once again, a lot of countries, the entire African continent is food deficient, as are some areas in the Western Hemisphere, like Mexico, Peru, Venezuela. Some Southern European countries like Spain and Portugal. Italy, net importers of food. When we talked about, a whole theme of this too is how human beings, improve the land to create more opportunity for agriculture. One was slash and burn that we talked about, because you're creating fertilizer for those crops. Another is, of course, any kind of fertilizer helps. Another is terracing that we saw, where you improve the natural slope of the land so you can expand the amount of agricultural area you have, because if you simply plant on a hillside, it might work for a year or two, but eventually all that good topsoil just rolls away downhill. Folks irrigate, and there's different types of irrigation. There's simply surface irrigation, where you divert a river, have the land slope. I mean, it's just very simple. The water comes out, rolls downhill, fertilizes whatever this crop is, maybe kale perhaps. Or you have sprinkler systems. These wheels, of course, you've probably seen these as you drive around. You roll them across the lawn. They're pulled in the U.S. They're pulled by machinery. And if you've flown over the western United States in particular, you've seen these crop circles, so to speak. And what these are, basically where you see these lines, this is called pivot irrigation. You have one well in the middle. Then this line is basically this row of sprinklers on wheels here. And of course, what they're doing is they roll that around in a circle, like the radius of a circle, and it irrigates the crops. And I think I have a map. I do have a map. I don't know if it's next. Yeah, if you see it on the left here, there's various areas of the United States where they use groundwater, because we're using up more rain than falls naturally. It's like using up petroleum. Eventually it's going to be gone. And yes, these aquifers, they're called. This is called the Ogallala Aquifer, after the Ogallala Indian group, the Ogallala Sioux. But anyway, these are the parts of the country where you see a lot of these crop circles when you fly over, because they're using up stored water, and eventually will run out. And it's true that, when you get heavy rains, the aquifers replenish themselves. But it's like, we're using a foot of water a year, and when you get heavy rains, it goes back up 3 or 4 inches. But then next year you use another foot of groundwater, and it goes back up 3 or 4 inches. Eventually you run out of it. And of course, the Great Valley of California, Central Valley of California, is one of the richest, perhaps the richest agricultural areas in the world, because of irrigation, because it doesn't get enough rainfall. And in fact, California, you could call it the world's largest plumbing project, where in California you have the drier interior valley, Central Valley of California, and the San Joaquin River flows out through San Francisco. But what we do is, because the Sierra Nevada mountains are located here, they get snowfall in the winter and so on, and a lot of rain usually, because California is in the midst of its worst drought at the moment. But I mean, that water is all pumped southward. From Southern California, you get into desert. That water is all pumped southward toward the big cities like LA, uh, Santa Barbara and San Diego and so on, but it's also used for agriculture. And California even uses water from the Colorado River, which eventually ends up going out to Mexico. There's almost nothing left of it. So much is used along the way for agriculture and drinking water and industrial water and so on, that there's almost nothing left when it comes out in Mexico. So irrigation is a way that people improve farmland. Another area, I have a map that shows you where this is, but we'll look at it first. In the Kazakhstan, so this started way back when Kazakhstan was part of the Soviet Union. Basically, we've drained an entire inland sea. It was one of the biggest inland seas in the world. Its area in square miles is about half the size of the state of Ohio. And now, that was in 1960. This water was diverted, particularly for use to grow cotton. In other words, they built a dam and they siphoned the water away, and they said, we're going to use this water for irrigation. Well, what happened to the lake? This is not over centuries. This is all since 1960. Here was the coastline in 1960, early 70s, late 80s. You could see it dying out. Basically, the lake drying and dying out. Coastline in 1999, the lake actually broke up into sections where there was deeper water here and there. Coastline in 2006. This is the Aral Sea, A-R-A-L. And what's left in 2009, just little bits and pieces of the lake, less than 1/10, or about 1/10 its area of what it used to be. It's one of the worst. This has been called one of the worst kind of human-created natural disasters, where we made an entire lake disappear. This is where it's located. It used to be part of the Soviet Union. Now it's a separate country of Kazakhstan on the border of Uzbekistan. Here's that lake right here. Again, it was about half the size of the state of Ohio, and now it's just down to kind of a couple of large ponds. Here's the Caspian Sea here. Where we are, we're north of Iran and Afghanistan. Pretty much the border between Iran and Afghanistan go directly north. You go through the various stands of these Muslim countries that are in used to be part of the southern Soviet Union. But anyway, here's the Aral Sea located here. It's more right in that region. Central Asia, pretty much. And you can see things like abandoned, rotting boats out in what is now desert, because this inland sea is like the Great Salt Lake. It's an inland sea is where it doesn't have an outlet to the ocean. Water flows in. So, of course, if you cut the water flowing in, the lake will eventually die out. Great Salt Lake is one. Salton Sea is one in California. Dead Sea in Israel is another. So in this case, we made the lake disappear. Distribution of cattle. We're talking about livestock now. We'll have a few slides about that. Of course, the United States has a lot of cattle throughout both the East and the Great Plains and so on. And in South America, through much of Brazil and also the Pampa of Argentina. The Pampa of Argentina was also, we talked about it in terms of wheat and corn and so forth, but it was also one of the biggest beef producing areas of the world. And Argentina is a big exporter of frozen beef, particularly to Europe. Europe has a lot of cattle. Basically, wherever you see people, you find cattle. Here's that strip, the Sahel area between the rainforest and the Sahara in Africa. Southern Africa's cattle. India. Now, it's interesting, in India, much of the population, the Hindu population, which is the majority of the population, doesn't eat meat, so they don't slaughter the cows, although Muslim population does in India. but they do use the cows for milk and dairy products. And in some parts, the cow dung is used as a fuel in a lot of rural India. Of course, China has a lot of cattle, and also Eastern Australia and New Zealand. But environmentally, beef cattle take up a lot of land. This is from a very recent issue of National Geographic, these slides. And this is a measure of the average square footage that beef cattle use compared to dairy cows, hogs and pigs, poultry, and land used for chickens that are producing eggs. And we'll see why this is, and it's largely because you have to feed cattle for about 2 years, year and a half to 2 years before they are slaughtered, so that the animal literally uses up all that energy in being alive for 2 years. Right? And this is one of the reasons why you get a very low return on beef, and we'll see increasingly around the world people are eating more and more beef, particularly in the United States we're eating less red meat. However, in most of the world, folks are having their chance now to go to steakhouses and eat beef, as we'll see. And this square footage is both, and well, some of this, the biggest bar here is how much of land is used up for pasture. And this measure is the average square footage required to produce 1,000 calories consumed by humans, and it's 1,500 square feet. You could produce 1,000 calories with more than 1,000 calories with one corn plant, right? And it gets, I don't know, 6 or 8 ears of corn. There's more than 1,000 calories there. But you have to have 1,550 square feet to feed that cow to produce the same amount of 1,000 calories. And this is true for all animals, because all of these animals, you're keeping them alive while, you got to feed them every day to keep them alive until they're ready to eat or whatever. But beef use many more resources than even dairy cows, hogs and pigs, poultry, and so forth. Beef cattle consume a lot of feed. Is another measure saying the same thing, compared to other animals like pork, poultry, eggs, dairy, and so forth. 3 times as much as pork. They use a huge amount of water because they're alive longer. The beef we eat is between 16 months and 2 years old. So that animal has been drinking water for 2 years. Whereas chickens are actually, mature chickens are like 7 or 8 weeks. And pigs are like 6 months. So just the fact that the cows are kept alive so much longer means they consume more food and drink more water. And they also generate more, because they've lived longer, more carbon dioxide affecting the atmosphere and so forth. Beef consumption is on the rise, especially in China, where the change in beef consumption from the 1960s through 2011 in China is 13 or 15 times as high, and in fact is now slightly above the amount of beef that folks eat. This is measured in terms of calories per day. So 453 calories per day consumed in China is more than the calories per day consumed for beef in the United States, because Americans, and to some extent other European countries, are actually reducing beef consumption for health reasons. We all know if you eat steak every day, you're going to have heart problems and all kinds of health problems and so forth. Notice Argentina still way above everybody else, 570 calories per day. They're still beef eaters, although they are not increasing their intake of beef. And in much of Africa, as you would expect, there's very limited consumption of beef. Look at 1/10. Here's Ivory Coast here. Cote d'Ivoire, which you saw a video about, only 49 calories from beef. You know, a little more than 1/10 that of the United States. Hogs and pigs raised in the United States. The Corn Belt, because mostly hogs eat corn for their primary feed. So Iowa has corn, but Iowa also has pigs. Iowa and southern Minnesota, a bit into Illinois, Indiana, and so on. There's a secondary area of hog production in North Carolina, which actually started out, and a lot of this processing actually takes place in Southern Virginia because of the Smithfield hams, which Smithfield hams made its name, a century ago when the hogs were only fed peanuts. So Smithfield hams made its name by producing peanut-fed hogs, which in peanuts were grown Southern Virginia, Eastern Carolinas. Now it's not true. They feed them corn like everybody else. They get their name, but Smithfield, people don't care anymore. But it's evolved into a big hog processing center in the United States. In the number of farms, here's another measure while we're talking about, this is cows per farm, and the reds, purples, and pinks are the highest amount of cows per farm. And the reason I show this is, again, it's a matter of, anywhere you drive in the United States, once you get out of the suburbs, right, you start seeing cows. So people say, oh, we have a lot of cows in New Hampshire. Oh, we have a lot of cows in Florida. Well, there's cows everywhere. But the question is, where are they most concentrated? And one measure is to talk about the number of cows per farm. And of course, it's the western United States, actually past the Corn Belt a bit, when you get into the Great Plains, and even some of the desert-like areas where there's nothing else to do with the land, so you graze cows on it, and you have a lot of, your farm may be 5,000 acres. Well, you could never afford 5,000 acres in Iowa, but drier, scrubby lands where there's very sparse grass, you can graze cattle out west because there's not a lot to do with it. And also, cattle grazing is allowed. A lot of this land is national park land that you lease from the government to graze cattle on it. But the United States government owns it. Either it's Forest Service land or a park land of some type. And where are meat processing plants in the U.S.? They're where the animals are, and the animals. This is a map of density. It's an interesting map. The density of meat processing plants. How many meat processing plants are there in each county, so to speak? Well, and they're here for different animals. So you have, this is the pork processing area of Eastern Carolina. You have the some in Pennsylvania, particularly with the Amish and German people, but mostly it's through the Midwest, that Corn Belt again, that grassland area, through starting in western Ohio, through Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and adjoining states, on both beef and pork, and then in northern Texas and eastern Colorado and Oklahoma Panhandle, a lot of beef cattle processing. Some in California as well. In the we're going to tie this back to Borchard and Chicago. The Borchard study about how stuff shifts around. First of all, notice how. Let me find Chicago for you. Chicago's at the southern end of Lake Michigan. Basically, Chicago grew up as a railroad city because it benefited from the fact that as the railroads were developing, right, a lot of traffic was going east-west across the United States. But if you think of it this way, all those railroads had to bend southward around the southern tip of Lake Michigan. We didn't, even today, we do not have the technology to bridge. Maybe we do, but nobody's ever built a bridge across Lake Michigan. So all this, as the Great Plains, the northern Great Plains were settled, the two Dakotas and Minnesota and so forth, and Wisconsin and Iowa and all this train traffic had to bend south to come through Chicago and then go on to the East Coast. So Chicago benefited from that, and it became the world's center of meat processing, because all these cattle in those days, in the days before refrigeration, the cattle were shipped live to slaughter, coming from the Great Plains after the cowboys drove them to the nearest rail. It was called the railhead. It meant the closest point where the railroad began. Then were shipped east to where the people were. And two people in Chicago in particular, Swift and Armour, which are still big major names in the meat, packaged meat business, and the people who shipped them to Kroger and so forth, were Swift and Armour, who invented didn't invent, but was the first to utilize the refrigerated boxcars and start processing the meat in Chicago instead of and shipping refrigerated meat east from the slaughtered animals rather than shipping the animals themselves. But the thing was, as to tie this to Borchardt study, as population spread farther and farther west, those centers shifted. So Chicago was, although I'll show you some slides of this, Chicago is no longer the beef processing center of the world. That shifted westward as the railroads were built, to be close to where the cattle are, because there's not a lot of point in shipping live cattle, right? You want to ship the processed meat. And the same thing is true with pork. In fact, Cincinnati used to be called Porkopolis because it was the pork processing center in the United States. Same thing was going on with the hogs coming out of the Corn Belt. But as railroads expanded and folks moved westward, those centers moved more toward Iowa and southern Minnesota and so forth. And cattle have a particular thing. Before cattle are slaughtered, you do have grass-fed meat, which is very lean, and some people consume that. And basically, the cow lives for 2 years on the prairie and is then slaughtered, and you get a very lean, non-fatty type of meat from it. Some people consume it, but 90% of the market is for fattened beef with a lot of fat in it, where the meat has this what's called the marbled texture, where there's a lot of fat in with the meat. That's what folks like. That's what you get at steakhouses and so forth. And in order to get that, they feed the cattle in feedlots. You take them off the range. So a typical beef cow has lived about 14 or 16 months, about a year and a half on the range, wandering around in pasture land. Then they're herded up and sent to feedlots, where before they're slaughtered for 4 to 6 months, they just eat grain, and that fattens them up. So they add weight, and it adds that fat to the meat. It gives it that marbled texture. And in the old days, through the 60s, that was in Chicago. They're called the Union Stockyards. You can see them here. The cattle were penned in, just eating for 4 to 6 months. This now is more like places as Kansas City. It's moved west a bit, but the process is still the same. The cattle get fattened up for 4 to 6 months before slaughter, and of course they consume a huge amount. Back to the fact about what proportion of how much land we need and how many, you dump in 1,500 calories on one end to get 1 calorie out the other end in meat.
because the cattle eat so much while they're fattening up in those last 4 to 6 months. A little bit about poultry. We have the broiler belt, which is in a different place, more southern through the Carolinas. It's almost the old cotton belt in a sense, but more southern because so you don't have to heat the barns and stuff. You can raise chickens farther north, as you see, but you've got to heat the barns more in the winter and so on. So it makes more sense to have it. Broilers are the name for the chickens that are eaten, as opposed to the layers, or the ones that produce eggs and so on. Here you see the inside. Chicken and poultry are produced in factory farms, just like the other animals. Here you see them in a barn. And there's a connection here with cultural geography, in that Hispanic population, a lot of the meat processing, these are dirty jobs. If you ever see that show on TV, would you like a job, slaughtering pigs in a factory? The motions are repetitive. Folks get carpal tunnel syndrome from, you're in a processing line, you're chopping blocks of beef into ribs or something. Same motions over and over, hundreds of times a day, and you get carpal tunnel syndrome. A lot of Americans will not take these jobs. And Hispanic immigrants looking for job opportunities now work in a lot of these meat processing plants. And in fact, if you look at this map, is not the map, it says U.S. Hispanic population, but look closely at the subtitle, percent increase. For a map of the U.S. Hispanic population, that would be focused on Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, kind of the southwestern quadrant of the United States. But if you look at where the Hispanic population is increasing fastest, it is following meat processing jobs that other folks don't want. So if you look at back to that map of meat plants, meat processing plants, slaughterhouses, Iowa, southern Minnesota, all the poultry belt, all the way through the south that we just saw. So there's a lot of Hispanic population following those job opportunities in the slaughterhouses. Last section of this lecture is about fishing and fish farming, because agriculture, we're defining agriculture meaning like producing food. So we've talked about crops, we've talked about livestock, we'll talk a bit about fishing. It's no surprise with the continuing increases in world population growth that much of the world is overfished. Basically anything in red and yellow. Red is seriously overfished. If you look at any of the traditional fishing areas, whether it's off northeastern United States in New England or Alaska, if you watch the show The Deadliest Catch, that's about Alaska fishermen, there's the overfishing. There's overfishing all around Europe, particularly around Iceland for cod, Norway, so on, all the traditional fishing areas. A lot of overfishing off of India, wherever there's dense population, right? Southeast Asia, China, Japan, you will find overfishing. The red is extreme, very high impact, probably more than is sustainable. The oranges, so all the Atlantic, factory ships go out here where they catch and process the fish and ships. Much of the Pacific. There are some areas, surprisingly, where there's relatively low impact, where you would not define it as overfishing, but it's not the majority. The majority of the world's oceans are overfished, but there's still a few areas left where it's not overfished. Excuse me. The big thing now is, world population has grown so much that we have what's called
aquaculture, which means fish farming. Fortunately, more and more we are farming fish rather than harvesting them from the sea, in part because the sea is overfished, and boats go out and only getting half of what they caught 5 years ago, that kind of thing. Or we're putting regulations in effect. Countries can put regulations in. Remember, they can control the resources 200 miles out. So the U.S. has just banned a large area off the northeast from cod fishing because the cod are so depleted. But you can only control 200 miles out. A country cannot control deep. Nobody basically controls deep sea fishing. But this is a map where they're trying to show the size of the country in proportion to the amount of fish production from fish farming. And fortunately for China, they're one of the major players in the fish farming business. The rest of Asia, particularly India and so on, is next. Africa, all the other continents do some. North America, South America, Africa, Europe, but the big players in the fish farming business are really India and China and adjoining countries, which is good because they have the populations that need those fish that are farmed. However, the rest of the world does it too. For example, here's a map showing salmon farmed areas in British Columbia, Canada. British Columbia, of course, here's an inset map here, is in between Alaska and Washington State. It's the Pacific coast of Canada. And salmon fishing, in this case, it's not farm ponds, because now we're talking about, you have both saltwater fish and freshwater fish, right? In the farm ponds, a lot of times that's tilapia. If you buy tilapia on the menu in the United States, inevitably it's fish farmed. It's farmed fish, fish sticks you buy, frozen fish, and so on. If it's generic white fish, it's going to be tilapia grown in farm ponds. However, these are saltwater fish, the salmon. So they basically put these big nets out there and drop, the boat comes by and drops pellets every day to feed the fish, like a big fish bowl. Then the nets, they lift the nets up with a crane type thing, and you have all the fish in them. There is also, with salmon, it gets a little confusing about to define whether these are farmed fish or not, because they have what they call fish ranching or salmon ranching. And what it means is, and they do this in both Canada and the United States, especially in Alaska, is you produce more fish in a lab from fish eggs, roe of the fish eggs. So you're artificially producing little baby salmons, right? Let them go out into the ocean. Salmon return to the same stream where they were released from or born. So it's almost the idea of like wild pigs. You let them go out in the woods and come back, and then go out and shoot them. So this is called fish ranching. You're not growing the fish in ponds or nets, but you're producing more fish that you released to the wild, but they're going to return. Now, on the way out there, could be that, Japan scoffs them up on factory ships, but the net effect is that more fish come back in, so it's a net benefit, and that's called fish ranching, some people call it. About half of fish consumed now in the world are farmed, and with some species like salmon, it's about 75%. Salmon are a cold weather fish. We're talking British Columbia, Alaska, right? Cold ocean fish. So the world salmon producers are Canada, the United States, Norway and Scotland in Europe. Then flip those latitudes, and Chile is a particularly big southern hemisphere producer in the
cold waters in the south of Chile, down toward Antarctica, where they have the ski resorts and so forth. Because remember, Chile's it's South American, but um, that extends into cold weather zones as well. And lastly, other types of, it's not just literally flapping fish, but things like clams, mussels, shrimp are also farmed these days. About half of shrimp is produced from wild shrimp, about half from cultivated or farmed shrimp. And of course, a lot of the shrimp is imported because you're going to sell shrimp, shell shrimp. Of course, that's a heavy, intensive labor, and pretty much that's going to be folks in Southeast Asia doing that. China, India, Vietnam, Thailand are the biggest shrimp producers, farm shrimp producers, and of course, there's a high labor cost to shelling those shrimp, as you can imagine by looking at the picture on the right-hand side. So I think that will end our lecture for today.